last time we talked about specificity and how that applies to your training and why it is so important. I mean, it is ranked #1. And so this time we're going to be talking about overload, which would be the second one. So overload is definitely something loads of people have heard about before. For overload to be effective, in very general terms, it needs two things. It needs to be within your max kind of capacity, like your max threshold of like what is possible. So you can't overload with something that isn't possible. Does that make sense? Because I mean, it would technically be overload, but if it's not doable physically, you can't overload with it, whatever that might be. So again, trying to overload with more than your 1 rep max is kind of by definition either your 1 rep max is not your 1 rep max, and you can overload with something greater, which should be your new 1 rep max, or it's fucking pointless because you're not going to do anything with it. The other thing it needs is to be greater on average than your recent historical training stimulus. So again, it just needs to be bigger than what you have kind of recently done. We're not talking about anything in particular with regards to the weights right now, because these two things kind of apply overall to everything with regards to how you overload. Doing 5x5 at 75% for an arbitrary number, following up by 5x5 at 70% or 62% is not overload. It is a net decrease in stimulus, so it's not overload. I feel like that's kind of obvious, but we need to lay the groundwork for later on stuff. Powerlifting context. It needs the minimum use of volume and intensity. So again, for instance, I mean, throw back to that previous example of 5x5, it needs to obviously be, depending on what you're training and what you're trying to overload. Again, if we throw back to specificity, if you are training for hypertrophy, volume, as well as being the biggest proponent in training fatigue, volume is also your main thing that you want to progress in hypertrophy-based training. You can't progress everything all of the time. It's definitely not just like a fast track all the way up, otherwise someone would have gone full Super Saiyan 3 and destroyed the universe ages ago. Probably Ed Cohen. Training that isn't intense enough isn't going to provide enough stimulus for you to actually adapt to anything. Same with stuff that isn't voluminous enough. Or if it is, so for example, we talked about last time of just maxing out every day, that would definitely have enough intensity stimulus. However, there's absolutely no volume stimulus. So we talked about when it would be appropriate to kind of approach those types of rep ranges and training styles in the last video with regards to specificity to competition. So it would definitely improve that specific idea. However, as like a long-term powerlifting goal, or for programming long-term powerlifting training, and long-term being anything more than like 8 weeks, maybe 4, you'd probably get away with it for like 6 weeks, maybe. So if you wanted to think outside of 6 weeks, you'd need to think about doing stuff that isn't just trying to do new 1-hour REMs every day. But back to what I was talking about, that would be an example of enough intensity stimulus. However, you aren't getting much volume stimulus, so it would be totally useless if you were trying to do any kind of hypertrophy. For powerlifting context-wise, training needs to be meeting minimum volume and strength prerequisites. Definitely, if it is volume-based training, further away from competition at the bottom of our old specificity pyramid. And it needs to maintain a certain amount of volume as you start to crank up the intensity. Obviously, you can't have both. You can't do... By definition, you can't have something that is loads of volume and loads of intensity. Intensity being defined by percentage of 1 rep max in this context for powerlifting. That doesn't relate to the fact that loads of volume is easy. Loads of volume is definitely hard. Like, it's more difficult to do more volume than it is to do high intensity stuff. If you don't believe me, please listen closely. 1 rep max every day, you will definitely last longer than trying to do 10 by 10 of the same lift every day. Like, I would put money on the fact you wouldn't make it a week. Feel free to prove me wrong and do 10 by 10 back squats at least 65% of your 1 rep max every day. back-to-back days straight out and see how far you... No, don't do that. You might hurt yourself, and I don't want to be responsible for that. But if you do that and ignore my warning, again, please send me the video, tag me in on Facebook, I want to see. Overload has to meet minimum volume and intensity landmarks. Fine. Usually, depending on what the training is, will dictate what those types of things are. Obviously, you're going to want to push volume a lot more if you're training hypertrophy, you're going to push intensity a little bit more if you're training for general strength. Next one that should seem really obvious. Training needs to get harder in general over time. Doesn't mean every consecutive session, so it's not like you have to come in and like PB every goddamn day on anything. It just means that you have to generally over time. So again, if we use our example of like a 12-week block, just so my hands are on screen, generally training over that 12 weeks needs to increase in some capacity. Like there needs to be general increase in any of the base factors. And again, we'll get into breaking it down in a minute, because there's a couple of terms that I want to kind of go over that I use a lot that help define volume landmarks in training. A lot of people who have been on the interwebs for a while will have seen plenty of powerlifters talking about setting, just like progressing at anything. So like, again, like getting one extra set, getting a couple extra reps, and not just straight increasing the weight, which is what a lot of people kind of tend to do because they think that's the only way to kind of improve. You can improve on other ways, however, throwback specificity, deciding on what you try and improve on, and what you try and put your focus towards would be dependent on what your training block is trying to get to. So, hypertrophy volume-based blocks, you're probably going to want to try increase set reps as well as weight, but you want to try prioritize the volume, then the weight. Perhaps you might try and just, again, you can do both. However, it would make sense that when you are trying to create hypertrophy and lots of training volume, that you would first try to increase training volume. There's nothing to say you can't do everything. You can increase training sets, reps, and weight, like all in a oneer. Why not? However, sometimes that isn't always possible, and so having like a set, or at least an idea of what priorities you want to apply to it in terms of what am I gonna chuck on, like an extra 5 kilos, or am I gonna try do an extra couple sets? In hypertrophy, you might want to just bump the sets up. In strength training, you might want to bump the weights up before you bump volume up. Again, think about it, discuss it. Why overload is second, without the specificity to kind of guide it, you have all the intent but no direction. Like, you could program the ultimate fucking progressive overload going, but it's actually in mileage or lengths in a pool, and that has absolutely no relevance to powerlifting. Although that would be pretty fucking cool. See how much Ray Williams could squat underwater. That would be pretty cool. Get some like some proper anaerobic training going on. Absolutely no cheating, no oxygen allowed. So now that we're going to get into how to break down some training stuff, there are terms. Again, all of this information can be found in Scientific Principles of Strength Training, written by Big Baby Blues himself, Chad Wesley Smith, Mike Israel, and Dr. Mike Israel, and Dr. James Hoffman. There are a couple of terms that they define in this book that are really helpful. So, again, the kind of training usually almost boils down to, and again, this is something pinched from Mike Tushier, is that if you can't answer how much weight should I lift, how many times should I lift it, your training is kind of flawed a bit. Like, if you can't answer those questions, specifically why you are doing those things, again, I mentioned it in the last video, of there needs to be a reason for stuff being there. I didn't say it had to be an amazing reason, but at least, or it had to be right. You just have to have a reason, and then your reason can either be wrong or right, and then you can, like, improve from there. Like, nobody's perfect. But that's how you kind of figure stuff out, is you're like, sweet, I want to try this. I think doing safety bar squats in my general strength block would be a good idea because it's pretty close to a squat. However, if I back squat too much, my wrists and shoulders get blown up and I can't even bench then, or squat, and it sucks, and I get hurt, and that makes training harder. Or I have to take off training all the time, whereas safety bar squats don't hurt my shoulders or wrists, I can bench great, and it's close enough to squat that I can use decent enough training loads to keep my, to carry over to my squat. That's a pretty in-depth kind of line of thinking for just putting one exercise in a program, but that's kind of how you would want to approach it. MRV, I'm sure some people have heard that by now, especially if you've hung around me for any length of time, which essentially is your maximum recoverable volume. That being the max amount of training volume you can do and still recover from. Again, we'll get into this kind of what I'm doing with my hand right now when we get into SRA curves, which is stimulus recovery adaptation curves, which is another topic down the list. Essentially, you sit along your little baseline of whatever. You train, you provide stimulus, you train, you go down, because your ability to perform whilst being battered from training is less. You recover, which means you come back up to where you started from, and then genuinely, you adapt a little bit. MRV, maximum recoverable volume, is essentially how low you can dip your curve and still get back up to your baseline in order to carry out training the next week. So essentially, so I'm pretty sure the time frame is defined as a week, because obviously given enough time, you could definitely recover from any volume. But because it's usually blocked off as a weekly total volume, you have to be able to hit that depth curve and still get back up to baseline, and then subsequently train again the next week. There is a limit. Like, there will be a limit that you just cannot push. It's not a question of, like, hashtag beast mode, like, I don't know, like, bump some lines of coke before you're training and just absolutely smash it. Like, there will be an amount of volume per week that you cannot exceed in a subsequent week. It will not happen. Either you will auto-regulate, and by that, it's a fancy word for being your fucking dumbass will get hurt, and then you'll have to take time off training, or, I don't know, like, there'll be some sort of, like, volume training clown that speaks to you from a sewer grate, and when you try and, like, unlock the secrets of pushing past your MRV, he eats your hand, or some shit. That will happen, guaranteed. Heard it here first, quote me on that. There will be a limit. Again, I'm not saying this limit is anything fun, like an MRV for, again, they're usually split up into body parts for hypertrophy training, so a typical kind of quad MRV might be in the region of like 22 sets a week. Like working sets, not dick around like warming up, like kind of fucking around waiting for the monster to kick in sets. Actual work sets. So if you did 10 tens twice in a week, that's still 2 sets short. Like, you're still slacking for your MRV. Think how disgusting that is. That's why. Because if you're not kind of pushing the bounds, like, if you're not trying to push it, you're kind of, you're not full-assing your training. Like, you need to, if you could do 22 sets in a week, why are you not at, again, there's a specific context for where going to MRV is appropriate. We'll get into that later. Just let me have my fun. If you're not pushing right towards the edge, then you're just not kind of getting enough out of your training. You could be doing more. And if you want to stack up training month upon month, year upon year, and make sure you're getting as much out of it as possible, you need to do that when MRV is appropriate. Usually right before you are planning to deload, on the off chance that you fuck it up and do too much. So again, if we go back, being defined as like how deep you can push the pen before it has to come back up to baseline and you need to actually live the next week, technically you kind of cushion yourself from needing to be able to do the next week part by usually deloading. So if you overcook this massively and it comes back around to the next time you should be squatting and you're like, no, not gonna happen, it doesn't need to happen because you're deloading. And also it means you're probably, because of how meaningful and how ridiculous the stimulus was in the last week, your deload is probably going to just be you spinning the wheels a little bit. Active recovery, you do actually have to do the deload, you can't just take the week off. However, you definitely will likely ride the compensation, adaptation, from that previous week of absolute disgustingness that has just occurred. Sometimes you might get through your entire deload, and then even the next week are still burst a little bit. Like, you're still not feeling quite 100%, like how you should feel after a deload, because you pushed it so hard, and then you have to redefine your initial week volume to compensate for that. Anyway, speaking of initial week volume, MAV is usually where you start that. MAV being minimal adaptive volume. Give you a second to think about what that might mean. It is the minimum volume, pen drop, minimum volume you need to cause adaptation. So we talked about how training stimulus has to be rowdy enough. I'm sure I used a better word than that. But your training stimulus has to be potent enough to warrant adaptation. Like, your body's not going to adapt from nothing. Like, you don't need adaptation to sit on your ass and make YouTube videos. There's no stress. You need to stress the system out a bit. So the minimum adaptive volume would be the minimum, like the C, the 55%, like the just scraping grade of training volume, just to kind of get you going. And then the last term I want to kind of quickly go over is MV, which is maintenance volume, which is essentially what the minimum you need to do to not get worse. So whatever you need to kind of keep stuff ticking along without regression, that's maintenance volume. Usually that's kind of what goes on deloads. Essentially, volume training pretty much boils down to start at the minimum you need to get better, work quite closely towards the absolute maximum you can live through, and there will be an upper threshold. However, you want to try and like nudge that threshold as much as you can. Like, if your coach or you have decided that based on arbitrary numberage or like the general ranges for most people, you're starting at 12, working to 20. So, or maybe even go 12, 14, 18, 20. Just for squats, let's say. So you are doing 12 sets a week, 12 sets of working sets of squats. So that's more than 5 by 5. That's 2 days of 6 sets at the very least, depending on how many you split them over. 12 sets in a week to 20 sets in a week. Funnily enough, overload. Hey, we got back on topic eventually. Overload of volume, because 20 is a bigger number of sets than 12. I feel that's obvious. So there's your overload on volume. If you're doing volume training, sweet, there you go. Your program is overloading. Like, you are generally trying to push the boat out in terms of total weekly sets volume. Cool. What else set-wise could you push the volume on? Well, you're gonna have to fit those sets in the same kind of training, so you're gonna have to increase. So your squat day will go from 6s up to possibly 6 sets up to 10 sets, possibly. Your set volume will have to go up to get to 20 sets. So cool, you've got that going for you. Awesome. Increase in weight. You should try and push the weights, or even on volume, and you don't have to push it a lot. You definitely don't have to push it a lot. Obviously, minimum intensity value for volume will be 60 to 65%. How else could you increase the intensity? By going closer to technical failure. So making sure you attain more inter-set fatigue through proximity to technical failure. So you come off a deload, start your first thing of volume training. MAV, you're doing 12 sets of squat a week. Cool. How intense should it be? Intense enough, but not destructive, not ridiculous. If you want to use RPE, they might be a 7 or a 7.5. If you want to use reps in reserve, keep 3 reps in reserve before technical failure. Not total failure, technical failure, because good form is literally everything. So start at your minimum adaptive volume. Do increasing, minimum adaptive volume at 3 reps from technical failure. As you go through, you may want to jump up to 2 reps from technical failure. That also leaves the possibility that if you get a bit zealous with the weight increases, if your proximity to intensity does not allow you to attain the desired rep range, so if you are looking to do sets of 12s, you've bumped the weight up, but you start hitting 2 reps from technical failure around about 10, so you can't complete your set of 12, you can just call that set at 10, being at 2 from technical failure, bump the weight down because you tried to jump too many hurdles at once, and then go back to hitting 12s with 2 reps in the tank. Then, near MRV, is the time for all you psychopaths to have fun, because you're going to go 1 from failure. And again, if you go 1 from failure, and it's more like 0.33 recurring from failure, when you're up on this last week before your deload, that's totally fine. Not great, but you've already put in place compensations to help with that. So if you do overcook stuff, you've immediately got a deload where you can chill the hell out and sort things that you need to sort, and not need to actually do anything on it the next week. So, you get to your last week. Not only is it 20 sets of squats in a week, this is like disregarding every other body part. You're just doing the 20 sets of squat might give some people the bug. So you've got your 20 sets of squats. They are at 1 from technical failure, so your intensity has increased dramatically. The intensity thing works both ways with the weight. So if you do a set of 12, and 12 isn't like one of those like, oh god, this sucks. If that isn't your last rep on 12, you need to bump that weight up, and that set doesn't fucking count. Only the work sets count towards your work sets. So you bump up the weight, and then achieve 12 disgusting sets in one workout, and then 20 through the whole week. So you have, in a self-constrained method of having to meet either intensity goals or rep goals, kept the weight increasing, because the weight you use from 3 from failure, when it's meant to be kind of easy, is definitely going to be less weight for the same reps that you can push like right to the brink. Your 12 rep max, or one under your 12 rep max, if you're behaving, is more than 3 reps from your 12 rep max. So there's a weight increase, because the reps are the same. You're doing 12s in both scenarios. Overloading weight. Sick. Strength training overload. Again, MRV and MAV definitely apply. There needs to be minimum volume thresholds. We talked about that earlier in the video. You can't just do 1 heavy single every day and expect to get better forever. Doesn't work like that. You need to actually have enough stimulus to elicit adaptation. Even on strength training, there needs to be enough volume at suitable intensities to increase rate of force production, or force production through muscular tissue. General strength block stuff needs to be minimum volume. What does that mean? So you would start at your MAV. That's definitely a fine volume to start with for strength training. How close would you push to your MRV? Not as close as if you were training volume, because you should hang off a little bit, because you are increasing the intensity substantially. So you are rather going from like 3 from fail to like 2 to 2 to 1. Just start at 2 for strength training. Like literally start it that difficult, because that will let you increase the weight straight off the bat. So instead of starting at 60 to 65, maybe start at 70 to 75 if you want an arbitrary percentage. And then work on your standard increases from there. This kind of twofold system of having your technical reps in reserve idea and your rep criteria like playing off each other to define how much weight you use, I feel works a lot better than just the arbitrary percentages. Again, it's harder to work out, or it's harder to apply a bit, because it is very perceptive and you have to go by how it feels. There's a degree of flexibility built into it, and it kind of corrects for itself. So if you feel like ass, you come in and you don't get as many, like what you thought would be a warm-up set has actually turned into a work set, because getting your 6 reps or however many you're getting from like going close to failure, or 2 from failure or whatever it is with a weight that you thought you would be warming up with, and it would be like a stepstone set to your work sets. That's one of your work sets, and you just have to keep going from there, because you're under-recovered. Congrats. We'll talk about under-recovery in fatigue management video, coming up soon. Cinema Year U. So yeah, you just want to progress intensity more of a priority than volume with strength training. You still have to do both. You still have to increase both. I would just take it from like volume and intensity and swap it around and have intensity and volume like that. Quick touch on peak training for competitions, again for peaking. Same kind of thing applies, however, like I had mentioned earlier, volume is going to decrease dramatically. So you really want to take your, pen was in this hand for training intensity, so your training like weights used, volume is just going to separate a good amount, so that you can get accustomed to loads closing in on your 1 rep max, like circa max loads, I think. One thing for peaking is that you will need to do enough to retain general strength. So again, if you look at your general strength volumes and intensities, peaking will obviously have to be greater than general strength tendencies, so you're going to have to use more weight for doubles, triples, singles than you do for fives. One of the things you will definitely be focusing on is dropping fatigue. So you need to drop fatigue. What is the main propagator of fatigue? Volume. So again, peaking training should have less volume than all other kinds of training because you are trying to reach your peak performance, and you cannot do that in the presence of fatigue. However, you obviously need to keep a certain amount of fatigue for a certain amount of time because you still want to maintain your level of fitness until you want to peak. So you need to keep it around for a while, and then it needs to separate out and you need to drop it and hopefully net gain in fitness by dropping fatigue. Cool, so guys, that is all I think we're gonna talk about. Video will be the aforementioned fatigue management video, which is essentially how to monitor fatigue, training fatigue specifically. Again, we're gonna have a talk about defining injury and training fatigue, and then we're gonna go chat about that for a while. So have a good week. I'll see you guys then. Ping me any questions, or hate mail, or stupid memes. I like all of those things. Catch you guys later.